Kimi Antonelli wins his first Formula One Grand Prix. It was a dominant weekend from Mercedes, winning the sprint and the Grand Prix on Sunday. But it's Sunday's result that will have everyone talking as the young Italian prodigy makes a statement in Shanghai. It was supposed to be a promising weekend for Ferrari with their Macarena wing, but it looks like they jumped the gun and still have some work to do to close the gap to the top. And it was a good Saturday for McLaren, but a terrible Sunday that saw both drivers sitting in the garage when the lights went out. Mechanical failures were a once-in-a-blue-moon event the last few years, but maybe they should be expected with these new regulations. We've got a ton to dive into coming out of the Chinese Grand Prix, and it's all coming up next on the Chicanery Podcast. You know, one of my favorite things about this sport is when we see a driver get his maiden victory in Formula One. And that's, of course, what we saw on Sunday with Kimi Antonelli winning his first Grand Prix of his Formula One career. And we'll get to Kimi in a second. But I feel like it's right to start with Saturday because, of course, this was a sprint weekend in Shanghai. So for the sprint race on Saturday, George Russell wins, Charles Leclerc comes in second, Lewis Hamilton comes in third. It was a pretty exciting sprint race. And of course, a pretty exciting start to the race that really carried a lot of the weight for this race up until George Russell kind of figured things out and started to pull away from the two Ferraris. And that's really the biggest thing that's making the difference so far this season between those top two teams being Mercedes and Ferrari, where we see it off the bat. Ferrari has the great start to every single race. They had the clear advantage in that area. But then Mercedes starts to catch up. They have enough to keep up with them for those first few laps. Those two cars, or four cars, if all of them are in the picture, are really battling back and forth. But then ultimately, Ferrari drops off a little bit, loses some of that race pace, probably down to tire degradation at the end of the day. But that's really the difference between Mercedes and Ferrari right now. We're at the beginning, like we've seen in Australia, like we saw this weekend. It's pretty close. But then 5-10 laps into the race, that Mercedes starts to pull away. And that's exactly what we saw on Saturday, where those two Ferraris, George going back and forth, but then George gets ahead and really just holds on to things and continues on for that sprint race win. Thank God for those two Ferraris, though. Fighting with George on Saturday, fighting with each other on Sunday, which we'll, of course, get to a little later. But without that, we thought these regulations were bad. I mean, imagine if we didn't have those fights in Australia, the fights this weekend in Shanghai, between the Ferraris, whether they're battling each other or they're battling one of the Mercedes. Not a lot going on. And we really would be critical of these new regulations, especially the promise that they would help with racing and make better racing, make overtaking easier. It would be really bad if we didn't have all of this action from Ferrari these two race weekends, but luckily we do. But for them, again, ultimately, you know, they've got a lot of speed in that car. They've got a good foundation, but they just don't have enough. And they don't have that overall race pace to close up with Mercedes and come away with a race victory unless something detrimental happens to the two Mercedes where they take each other out or deal with some sort of reliability issues. But not exactly the type of Saturday that Ferrari was hoping for, but still P2, P3 for both of those drivers. Finishing at least ahead of one of the Mercedes is something to come away with. And it was a rough Saturday for Kimi Antonelli. Of course, a great Sunday for him, which we'll get to in a little bit. And the second half of Saturday, of course, was great with him getting pole for the Grand Prix on Sunday. But for that sprint race, terrible start, falling all the way down to 8th, starting from P2 on the grid. And that's been something up until the Grand Prix on Sunday that has really been a problem for Kimi. Just not getting those race starts down. Now, of course, he did get it right in the Grand Prix on Sunday, so hopefully that's something that'll continue into the future. And it's just some bugs that he had to work out with that start procedure and getting used to the new changes and everything that comes with that car. But for Saturday, at least, with that sprint race, awful start for him where he just inched off that line, almost had a repeat incident of what happened last weekend with Liam Lawson and Franco Colapinto, but not a great start, and that really put him on his back foot. Of course, then he had the contact with Isaac Hadjar on lap 1, got a 10-second penalty for it. I thought it was pretty deserved. He admitted to it after the race, apologized to Isaac. Isaac wanted nothing to do with it, which I thought was really interesting. But at the same time, these drivers are caught up in the heat of the moment. You understand having an emotional response at that point. And I'm sure they'll be fine moving forward and there won't be any bad blood between the two of them. But Kimi definitely deserved that 10-second penalty. Came in, served it, of course, ended up finishing P5. Got lucky that there was that safety car and he was able to serve it and kind of, do some damage control there. But ultimately finishes P5, not where the team wants him to be, of course. This is a top contending team. Having even one of the McLarens finish ahead of him was pretty surprising. But again, in a sprint race, having that penalty, not serving it until the second half of the race, it's going to catch up to you like that. So pretty rough Saturday for Kimi Antonelli, but sometimes that's the way it goes. And like we saw on Sunday, things turned around a little bit for him. Pretty good Saturday for McLaren, though. Like I said, P4 for Lando Norris, at least finishing ahead of Kimi. Very promising. P6 for Oscar Piastri. They looked a lot more competitive than they did in Australia, and I think that's something that we can expect to continue for this team as they move forward throughout the season. Of course, there's a lot to talk about with Sunday with them and not even starting the race for both cars and the issues that they saw there, but as long as they're on track, as long as they're getting the data, things should start to improve for them. They should start to learn more about this Mercedes power unit because, like I said in the last show, they're at a huge disadvantage right now because Mercedes handed over that power unit in Australia, but didn't hand over any of the data that Mercedes had been relying on, and data that looks like it's been crucial for Mercedes in understanding how these power units work and just exactly how to maximize the performance with this car. So a lot to learn for McLaren, but P4, P6 is a very good indication that they're heading in the right direction and they're starting to figure things out and they're starting to close that gap a little bit between themselves and the top teams. Different type of Saturday for Red Bull. Very, very tough Saturday. Again, terrible start for Max Verstappen. We're seeing this with a lot of drivers where just the start procedure, everything that goes into it, revving the engines for 10 seconds, realistically, really tough, really different for a lot of these drivers. But I'm a little bit surprised that Max is struggling this much with this start procedure. I would think a driver like Max, having the abilities he has, being able to move from different series to different series, of course, a lot of that we see on iRacing, but some of that does transfer over, and we have seen him start to, dabble into endurance racing now. But just with his knowledge, just with his overall racing ability, his instincts, again, these new regulations, a lot of people say they're not racing. I think there's some truth to that. But Max struggling this much, pretty surprising. And of course, that's what we saw on Saturday. We saw it again on Sunday, which is something I'll get to a little later. But just having a really hard time. And after that bad start on Saturday, of course, he was playing catch-up. And also playing catch-up in a car that really struggled this weekend. Had no grip throughout the practice sessions, throughout qualifying. The performance just wasn't there. And at the end of the day, this Red Bull looked more like a midfield team than one of the top contenders. But for Max on Saturday, with that bad start, with all the struggles that this car has right now, not a lot he can do to salvage that situation. So he ends up finishing in P9. Not the best result for him and not the best result for his teammate either. Of course, had that contact with Kimi Antonelli that gave him floor damage, really took him out of contention. And again, like I said, not too happy about it. I haven't seen any interviews with, Isaac and him being asked about that whole incident after the fact, after his, emotions have calmed down a little bit. So again, something to keep an eye on, but something I don't think will really carry over into the next race weekend and will be kind of brushed off by both of those drivers and both will move on. But not great for Red Bull on Saturday and not great for them on Sunday either, which we'll get to. But for their sister team, the junior team, Racing Bulls, Liam Lawson finishes P7. Another good result for him. I'm really impressed with him this year. Of course, in this sprint race, he made up a few spots at the start and just kind of worked his way up the field from there and got all the way up to P7 throughout that race. But again, very impressed with Liam. I've been very critical of him over the past few years. A lot of mistakes made on his part. But this season, I don't know what has changed. I'm assuming it's just maturity. He has really turned a leaf and has looked a lot better this year and a lot more confident. And more importantly, he's putting in the results that the team needs to see. So, very good Saturday for Liam Lawson. For the rest of the midfield teams, like I said, a lot of them treated this as a testing session. So, not a lot to talk about there. And just not a lot of action down the grid in those midfield teams. So really good sprint race. And again, this was probably a very good track. That's something that I've, kind of harped on a lot over the years as these sprint races have become more popular. I don't mind them. I like having a sprint race on a Saturday opposed to having another practice session where you're just kind of looking at teams running simulations, different race programs, trying to just guess what's going to happen. Now, I do agree having the sprint race on Saturday kind of takes a little bit away from Sunday. You don't have that build up that a traditional race weekend has. You don't have that anticipation going into Sunday because you're tipped off a little bit and know a little bit what to expect as far as the race is concerned. But the important thing to me is making sure we have these sprint races at tracks that make sense. We're going to have Singapore later in the season for a sprint race. Probably one of the stupidest decisions I think F1 could have made, putting it at a track where overtaking is nearly impossible. Now, of course, it's another question with these new regulations and what that'll mean, but we need to make sure we have these sprint races where they belong. And I think China is a circuit that can definitely support a sprint race and give us a good sprint race on a Saturday. And I think that's exactly what we saw this weekend in Shanghai. All right, let's talk about Sunday. Like I said in the intro, whenever a driver in Formula One gets their maiden victory, it's always something special. And that's probably something that'll never change. Watching that driver accomplish that feat for the very first time in their career, watching their weight lifted off of their shoulders, watching the emotions pour out of them, like we saw with Kimi today in that post-race interview, watching all of the other drivers come up to congratulate them and enjoy that moment with them. It's special, and it's always going to be special, and it's always something that should be cherished by us fans, and that's exactly what we got today with Kimi Antonelli getting his first win of his Formula One career, also becoming the first Italian driver to win a Grand Prix in 20 years. For Kimi, we knew this day would come, and it was just a matter of time, especially with him being on Mercedes, and especially coming into this year with how strong that Mercedes looked. We knew George was probably the better driver coming into the season, but it was still the question of how close is Kimi going to be? Can he capitalize if George falters and falls down the order and it's not really his day, but that Mercedes is still strong? Can Kimi put that car in that position to get it done, only being 19 years old? A lot of pressure on this kid, a lot of hype, a lot of conversations about, is he too young for this? Is this the right move? Does he belong in this seat? And he put all of that to rest today, finally achieving that first victory in Formula One. Of course, it started on Saturday with that pole, but even with that pole, it was still a question if he would be able to hold on to that position after what we saw in Australia, after what we saw in the sprint race this weekend, because Kimi in race starts, not the best combination so far this year. And that was a big concern heading into the Grand Prix on Sunday because we saw him drop down the order in Australia. We saw him drop down the order on Saturday in the sprint race. And there were a lot of expectations, especially with those two Ferraris behind him. There's a good chance he was going to drop down the order on Sunday in the Grand Prix. And he did lose the lead to Lewis at the start, but he didn't lose position to George, and he didn't lose position to Charles Leclerc, which was crucial for him for this race because that allowed him to build a 7-second lead. He, of course, had to battle with Lewis for a little bit, for a few laps, but ultimately got ahead of him. And like it was in the sprint race on Saturday, that Ferrari can keep up for a little bit, but 5 laps in, 10 laps in, that pace really starts to fall off. And that Mercedes is clearly ahead of that Ferrari. So Kimi getting ahead of Lewis, getting into the lead, starting to build that lead while George is still behind, trying to pass Charles Leclerc and then trying to pass Lewis. Very beneficial for Kimi's race and allowed him to get a 7-second lead by the time that George ultimately got around Lewis and got into second place. But after that, a lot of us, including myself, were sitting there thinking, all right, maybe Kimi can hold on to this. Maybe he'll still come away with the win. But of course, George is going to close up the gap and start to, show his strength, get into clean air, and maybe make this a fight between those two. It didn't happen. Kimi maintained that lead, at times even extended that lead up to 8-9 seconds. It was really impressive, and I think that was the biggest takeaway for me coming out of this Grand Prix, especially with Kimi, because this wasn't just really a freak accident or a freak race where He capitalized on some misfortune with George falling down the order and getting stuck behind the Ferraris. And, there was just a little bit of what ifs. Kimi was the fastest driver on track today. There isn't any doubt about that. And specifically with his teammate, his biggest competitor in George Russell, both of those cars were in clean air. George wasn't fast enough. Couldn't close the gap. Now, of course, it is fair to ask the question, how much did George burn through his tires trying to get around those Ferraris compared to what, Kimi had? How much battery, this was something that was brought up on the broadcast too, how much battery did George drain and how much did he hurt his performance by using all of that battery fighting past those Ferraris where Kimi's out in front and, not really doing much. But at the same time, there was a period where Kimi had to use his battery to fight with Lewis, and he was still able to pull out that gap. So I think a lot of this just comes down to Kimi's skill opposed to just some fortunate luck that swung his way today. But just an awesome moment watching him cross the finish line, watching all of the emotions come out of him, hearing that radio message. Bono, calling him, we're so used to get in there, Lewis, and then he hits us with get in there, my son. Kimi crying in the post-race interview and just all of those emotions coming over him. But also, too, just the symbolism in a way of Lewis Hamilton being on this podium for Kimi's first win. The driver he replaced at Mercedes, one of the greatest drivers, if not the greatest driver that this sport has ever seen. Really special. And something that will probably be a highlight of this season, be looked back on for years, and just be a really special moment for Kimi in his career. Now, of course, there was a few funny moments. I don't know if anyone caught it, but on the podium, as he's coming out and being announced, they announced him as Kimi Räikkönen instead of Kimi Antonelli. I thought it was very fitting because there have been so many radio messages just with his blunt. He speaks very good English, but still a little bit broken. But those radio messages where he's just out of breath and just almost screaming into the radio kind of gives me shades of Kimi Räikkönen back in the day in his radio messages. So thought it was a little funny that out of all the drivers that get mistaken for him, that's the one that he gets. But again, just an awesome, awesome Sunday for Kimi Antonelli and an awesome moment for the sport. But a better question too, and a bigger question when we're talking about long-term with Mercedes and with this season, how is this going to affect George Russell moving forward? It was a sloppy weekend from George. He had reliability issues in practice, both with the rear wing. I think it was the gearbox 2 in either qualifying or not FP3, but maybe FP1. I can't remember exactly when it was, but had plenty of reliability issues throughout the weekend, and something that kind of just threw off his mojo and threw off his momentum and kind of put him on his back foot. But again, George was able to qualify. George was able to get up and start the race in P2. He was in position. Put all the stuff that happened throughout the weekend aside, he was in position to capitalize on the race, and he just didn't. And he got beat on pure pace by his younger teammate. And you have to wonder, what does this mean for George's confidence moving forward in exactly how he approaches each race weekend and exactly how he approaches Kimi as his teammate? Because he's had a very comfortable first year in 2 months, 3 months, however it's long it's been, but he's never really been under threat by his teammate. He's always been in this mentorship role. He's always been viewed as the clear number one driver. And now he's got a teammate who's a Grand Prix winner. And there are 4 points that are separating them in the driver's standings right now. Now, of course, it's extremely early. We've still got 20 more race weekends to go now with the cancellation of the Bahrain Grand Prix and the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. But for the first time, there's a little bit of pressure from his teammate on George Russell. And that's something that he hasn't dealt with as being the number one driver since he's gotten into F1. Of course, he came in, was on Williams for a little bit. He was the number one driver at Williams at the end of it, but there was no expectation that they were going to win races or be in championship contention. So it's very different in that regard in those types of situations compared to being at a top team like Mercedes. But he's never really had to deal with this in his F1 career because when he was at that top team, he was fighting with Lewis, and he was that second driver, the younger driver that was trying to play catch up and trying to show that he had what it takes to be in that seat and be that number one driver for that team. So very interested to see how this is going to play out with George, because we've seen him. He hasn't dealt with a lot of pressure this season up until this point, but that changes a lot now that Kimi's in the picture. And it's something that's been a problem for George in the past, dealing with that type of pressure. We've never really seen championship pressure. It's mostly been pressure to win a race and capitalize on a specific moment, but it's a different ball game for George coming out of this weekend, and something that I'm very, very interested in watching as this season unfolds. But at least for this weekend, at least for this team, could not have been better for them with these results, winning the sprint race, winning the Grand Prix, having this young driver finally capitalize and finally win a Grand Prix, putting all of those rumors, all of that criticism to rest about, does Kimi belong here? Was this too early? Is he too young? Does he really have what it takes? I think he has what it takes. And I think we're going to continue to see that as the season unfolds. And I think we're going to continue to see Kimi on the top step of the podium. For their closest competitor, though, Ferrari, P3 for Lewis Hamilton, P4 for Charles Leclerc. Not the worst results, but not exactly what they were hoping for. And for a lot of people, including myself, I thought Ferrari was going to come into this weekend and really have a shot. This was going to be a track that suits their car a lot better. The Macarena wing was going to do wonders for them, give them a boost in performance, and they were likely going to come out on top. But unfortunately, they just don't have what it takes right now. They're fast. Like I said, they nailed these race starts. Every single one that we've seen. Doesn't matter where they are. They're going to be at the front going into turn one, and they're going to have a huge advantage there, at least until these teams start bringing upgrades and start closing the gap in that aspect. But they've got the good starts. They can keep up with Mercedes or whoever's at front. In the sprint race on Saturday, they were keeping up with the McLarens, who were somehow up there, which we'll get to in a second. But after that, after a few laps, kind of just fall back. They lose pace to Mercedes and they lose performance to Mercedes. And there's a sizable gap. Looks like Mercedes is tier 1. I would say Ferrari's probably tier 2. McLaren, Red Bull tier 3. So Ferrari's kind of in this just middle ground, stuck in between being the best team and being the worst of the best teams in McLaren and Red Bull. So kind of just stuck in no man's land. But they've got a long way to go to really catch up with performance, because like we've seen in 2 race weekends, Mercedes has a clear edge over them over an entire race, and it's something that's not really as close as Ferrari was hoping for. And it's just another disappointment for Ferrari, because this is another season where they came into it. I'm already kicking myself for my championship predictions, thinking that Ferrari is going to come away with the constructors and just buying into that. I mean, it's a 2 decades now where we've gone through this almost every single season, where it's like, yep, Ferrari's going to be good. Oh, just kidding. They're not good. They still have a long way to go. I don't know what to say anymore. I mean, for all you Ferrari fans who've been Ferrari fans for a long time, you're probably just numb to it at this point. But they can't get it right when it comes to this stuff. And they can be there, they can be close like they are right now, but they can't get over the hump and really turn this car into a championship contender. And that's probably the biggest thing that I'm worried about with Ferrari this year, because right now they're in second. Without a doubt, the second best team. Where were they last year at this point? Second best team. McLaren was the Mercedes of last year. They were close to McLaren, but McLaren was out of reach, and there was still a sizable gap in between Ferrari and McLaren. And now they're in the same position. And where did they end up last year? 4th, when it was all said and done. Because we've seen it year and year and year. Ferrari's not the best when it comes to development. At least not as good as the other top teams. Red Bull's a lot stronger. Mercedes is a lot stronger. McLaren is a lot stronger. So right now, Ferrari is second, but where are they going to be in 3-4 months when we're at the halfway point of the season, when these teams start to bring upgrades and they start to really close that gap to Mercedes? Is Ferrari going to be able to keep up? And are they going to be able, if they can keep up, close that gap to Mercedes and out-develop Mercedes and really get on top of this car? That's a big question I have, in something that I honestly don't have a lot of confidence in with Ferrari. But just a long way to go. But at least for this weekend, P3, P4, they probably maximized everything they could have out of this race, considering where they are on ultimate race pace with the Mercedes cars. But really good racing between those 2 drivers. And that gave us a lot of excitement in this Grand Prix. thank God for that again, because without that, I don't know where we would be right now with all of the action and all of the criticism at the end of the day about how bad these regulations are. At least we're getting that. And it was not only exciting, but very respectful between those two drivers. They are very good at wheel to wheel racing. We shouldn't be surprised at all because we're talking about Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc, one of the two best. I mean, Charles, even though he doesn't have the championship pedigree, we've been talking about Charles being the best wheel to wheel racer for a very long time. So, shouldn't really be surprised there, but it's great to see, and it really highlights how strong these drivers are in that they're at the top level of racing when we see racing like we did between Lewis and Charles today. Just going through all of those corners, wheel to wheel, giving each other enough space, but not compromising their own performance and just really sticking the car where they want to try to get that advantage. There's a lot of talk about these new regulations, and I do agree with just this whole artificial racing thing where, are these real overtakes, or is this more of just, all right, you have battery, now I have battery, and I'm passing you, and we're just going back and forth, but it's not a true overtake. I get that to an extent, and I think this weekend we saw less of that. We still saw some of it, but there were actual overtakes and actual racing that was going on, and some of that happened between these two drivers. And at the end of the day, maybe it's something we just need to get over a little bit as fans and just appreciate just having some excitement. Now, of course, there are the other issues with the regulations and, just these cars being pushed flat out and the lifting and coasting or the super clipping and all of those issues with the battery. But just the actual racing on track, the excitement that we get from that racing, it's a good thing. And I know a lot of people are critical about that, but do we not remember what it was like the last couple years? Watching these cars not even be able to do this, not even be able to follow each other and go wheel to wheel. I mean, yeah, it was different. Yeah, they were pushing more flat out. They were pushing the car to their limits. I agree. We need to get back there. But if we at least have this, and we've got this back and forth, and we've got this excitement, and we don't know who's going to come out in this part of the track or who's going to get past here, it's at least something. And it's at least a foundation that can give us some excitement and give us something to be happy about until we figure out the rest of these regulations and the rest of these issues, and we can get back to these cars being pushed flat out. And hopefully when that happens, we've still got the wheel-to-wheel racing like we've had in these first two race weekends. So happy to see that, at least from these Ferraris. And again, not the best weekend, but not the worst. But they just need to close that gap, and they need to start developing this car so they don't get out-developed like we saw last year with them in McLaren. For McLaren, though, tough Sunday. Mechanical problems with both cars, rumored to be electrical at first, but then later confirmed to be gearbox issues, power unit issues for both of those cars. Second straight did not start for Oscar Piastri. I mean, it literally could not be a worse start to the season for him. Not starting in Australia, not starting here. All he has is the sprint race from Saturday. That's the only race time that he has on track this season. And that's a crucial blow, not only for him, just trying to bounce back from last season, all those just disappointments from that collapse and losing the championship lead, but for McLaren too. The biggest problem they have is they have this new Mercedes power unit, and they don't know how it operates to its maximum potential. They don't know the ins and outs of it, and the only way to discover that is getting this car on track, running race laps, getting the data, figuring it out from there, and learning as they go. And that's why, it's probably going to be a long season for McLaren. I do think they'll be back on top. I do think maybe even at the end of the season, they might be competing for race wins. We'll have to see. But you have to have faith in this McLaren team and just their ability to develop this car throughout a season like we've seen the last 2 years, really the last 3 years, going all the way back to 2023. But for now, they need that track time. And with all of these reliability issues, they're just not getting that. Now, it is probably something that we probably need to get a little more familiar with and just expect a little more, because we saw the last 2 years, really the last 3 or 4 years, reliability was almost a non-factor. We would get a retirement here and there, but not what we were used to when you go back to the 2000s, the 2010s, even the 90s, 80s. I mean, reliability has always been a huge part of this sport. And just this kind of unknown that you have every single race of, all right, are these cars going to hold up? What's the power unit going to look like? Heading, what's the gearbox going to look like? Can all of these engine components hold up throughout a whole season? We haven't really gotten that much the last few years because the power units from the last regulations had been around since 2014. So by the time we get to 2024, 2025, I mean, these teams have it all figured out. They know exactly how to run these engines. They know exactly what to look out for. Reliability was basically canceled out. But now we're starting fresh with these new regulations. And we saw it last weekend. We saw it this weekend. Not only with McLaren, of course, we had Gabriel Bortoleto, Alex Albon not starting the race. We had a number of retirements with Max Verstappen, of course, the two Aston Martins. We had retirements yesterday in the sprint race too, Nico Hulkenberg. It's something that's going to happen a lot more frequently, and something that should be expected and really not be that surprising because there's a lot to figure out with these new power units and with reliability. And it seems like it might be a little bit of a problem for these Mercedes customer teams. Of course, we'll get to Williams in a second, who seems to have a lot more problems than McLaren. But for McLaren, just an uphill battle for them as they're trying to figure this out and as they're trying to get back on top and really be a true contender again. But again, the only way to fix that, the only way to address that is to get on track and run those race laps. And that's just something that they're struggling to do right now. And something that hopefully will be addressed, and hopefully they'll get that run time in Japan, especially for Oscar, because I can't imagine what he's feeling right now, having all of this anticipation, building up to the season, having your home race as the first race of the season, not being able to run that, having that disappointment, trying to brush it off and say, all right, bounce back, China will be a different story. And then something like this happens in China. He doesn't even get on track. So really frustrating for him, really frustrating for the team, but just something that they're going to have to work through and something that they're going to have to be a little patient with. For the other top team, Red Bull. Tough Sunday for them too. That car was nowhere this weekend, just struggling and sliding all over the track, no grip, tire degradation was terrible, power unit issues, gearbox, I mean, just everything was going wrong for this team this weekend. For Max, another terrible start. And again, I'm really surprised that Max is struggling this much with these start procedures and just not being able to get a handle on this whole procedure and how it works and just continuing to have these slow starts. It's just not Max Verstappen. But it wasn't just the terrible start for Max. He had a lot of misfortune that came into this race too. And without that misfortune, he would have made something out of this race and come away with a solid number of points, at least finishing in P6. But tire deg, like I said, is a huge issue for this Red Bull. But Max comes in because of that tire deg, pits a lap before the safety car comes out. So huge disadvantage for him there. Just not being able to capitalize on that cheap pit stop, kind of pushing him down the order and just making him play catch up throughout that middle half of the race. And he did do a very good job at playing catch up though. And he did make something out of this race, made it all the way up to P6. Was in position that was probably as high as he was going to go. But a very good position, especially considering where he started throughout this race. But then, of course, lap, I think it was 46, just 10 laps to go, almost there. Has cooling issues, forced to retire the car, has to bring it in. Tough Sunday for Max. And I think what was more concerning, too, was Max's comments after the race. Of course, we've heard him talk about this at length with all of his issues and all of his frustrations with these new regulations, how he feels like it's not racing. It was a new low for him in the media pen, talking to the press, giving more comments and more thoughts after this retirement. Max is in a really dark place right now. And I don't know where this is ultimately headed with Max. Of course, he's going to finish this season. I think, I doubt this will be his last year. I think he's going to have a little faith and put in a little effort, like he's already alluded to, in helping the FIA fix these regulations. But he's not happy at all, and he doesn't enjoy this type of racing. In fact, he said anyone who thinks it's fun or funny, or I forgot the exact quote, but anyone who enjoys it, clearly doesn't know what racing is and clearly just doesn't appreciate F1. So not good for Max and not what you want to hear. And I wonder how long is this going to go on for him, because it's not just these regulations. This is kind of just the tip of the iceberg, but a lot of internal stuff has happened with Red Bull that Max has warned us about, saying, if this happens, I'm not going to be too happy. And I don't know what the future will look like if this happens. And now those things have happened. And now these regulations have happened. And it's just building and building and building. And my best guess is Max probably stays here for 2-3 more years, maybe. But after that, if it's not any better, I wouldn't be surprised at all if we see him leaving the sport, going into endurance racing, for example, something that he truly loves, maybe even walking away from racing altogether. Hard to imagine that happening, knowing his DNA and just how Max Verstappen is wired, but I don't think he's going to put up with this forever. And if there's no hope, if there's no light at the end of the tunnel, it's just not going to look good. And it's not going to be a good situation for Max, and it's going to be something that ultimately pushes him out. But there's a long way to go for him to get to that point where he's comfortable in this sport again. And this team has a long way to go to catch up and at least take care of that with Max and at least get this car back to a competitive level. Because for this weekend, this looked more like a midfield team than a top team. And like I alluded to, the Red Bull power units, not the most reliable, and they've got a lot to figure out there. We've seen issues with Max. We've seen issues with Isaac. We've seen issues with Arvid Lindblad. Somehow Liam Lawson has escaped, but not the most reliable power units from Red Bull and Ford, and that's something that's probably expected or should be expected. Coming into these new regulations, having a new supplier for your engine and just coming in not blind but just inexperienced. There's going to be a big figuring out period, and that can be something that can be really risky when you have a driver like Max Verstappen and a driver who's just not too happy with things. For his teammate, though, Isaac Hadjar finishes P8, at least comes away with some points. Had an unfortunate start to the race, spinning on lap 1, fighting Ollie Bierman. Just another instance of that rear axle locking under braking, something that definitely needs to be addressed. I don't know if it's on the team side to address and fix. I don't know if it's on the FIA side as far as the regulations are concerned, but it's something that needs to be addressed because it's not good. And it's happening to too many drivers where they're just losing the car out of nowhere. And it looks really weird, and it just looks almost unpreventable in a way. So hopefully that gets straightened out, but unfortunately for Isaac, did not get straightened out for this race, and something that definitely threw off the race because he had to come in at the end of lap 1, of course, flat spotted his tires like crazy, without a doubt, had to come in and put fresh tires on, but then came in again during the safety car period on lap 10. So 2 pit stops when it was a 1 stop for most people, and that 1 stop was under the safety car. So just on his back foot, but credit to him for at least making something out of this and at least getting the car up to P8. But again, this car just isn't where it needs to be, and they have a long way to go to really become a true competitor at the top again. Y'all know what time it is. It's time to talk some midfield teams. Who is the top midfield team? Who is the best of the rest this weekend in China? It's got to be Haas, right? I mean, another exceptional performance from Ollie Bierman, finishing P5. He started P10, so if I'm being honest, if I'm being unbiased with my commentary, I mean, of course, 3 of those positions were gained because of the 2 McLarens not starting and Max retiring at the end of the race. And for Ollie in his race start, it was good. It wasn't anything spectacular. It wasn't anything that blew us out of the water. But with these new regulations, at least for now, it doesn't really matter much where you start and if the start is good or bad, because if you have the pace, it should sort itself out as the race goes on, and you'll probably end up where you're supposed to over the full course of 57 laps like we saw today. And that's exactly what we saw today with Haas and with Ollie Bierman. He had the pace and he worked his way up, and he deserved to work his way up all the way up to P5 to finish this race. And this result was really about not really luck, not really strategy, just Ollie putting in consistent laps throughout the entire race and really just getting the most out of the car. And he's, out of all of the drivers, really been one that seems to have a really good handle on these new cars, all of these new modes. I don't know what it is about his past experience that's helping him with this, or maybe he's just instinctively better at managing these cars and dealing with all of these new modes. I'm not entirely sure, but he really has a good handle on these new cars, and he's been putting in some very consistent performances and really outperforming this Haas car and getting it into some really solid points finishes, like we saw today. I mean, this is not as good as Mexico City, but similar to Mexico City. What business does Ollie Behrman and a Haas have finishing a race in P5? Now, again, helped by Lando and Max, so a little different than it was in Mexico, but still, I'm very impressed with Ollie in just his ability to drive. And I've said it so many times, I'll say it so many times in the future. He's going to be around for a while. He's going to be on a top team before we know it. And he fully deserves that based on everything that we've seen in his first season and 2 races of his Formula One career. Well, I guess more than that because of the Ferrari stint when Carlos Sainz had the appendix issue. But still, very impressed with Ollie. And I know Haas has to be happy with his performance. And also, too, it could have been a lot different for him today. A really scary moment at the beginning of the race where Isaac Hadjar spun out in front of him. Ollie almost crashed right into the side of him. Watching his onboard, if you haven't seen it, go check it out. I don't know how. It wasn't as close as Franco Colapinto with Liam Lawson last weekend, but it was still, how did you avoid that car? Because Isaac spins out and then his car goes into reverse as Ollie's trying to go around behind him. Really, really close call. Really good instincts from Ollie to try to navigate around that and not lose too much time and too much speed. But could have been a lot different for him and could have been a lot different for Haas this weekend. But very different for Ollie's teammate, Esteban Ocon, compared to what Sunday was like for Ollie. Because for Esteban, he started 13th, made it all the way up to 9th at the start, but then halfway through the race came that incident, the contact with Franco Colapinto coming out of the pits on lap 33. Esteban ends up getting a 10-second penalty for the whole incident. I think he deserved it. I think he admitted he deserved it. I did see an apology on social media afterwards. I think he gave one in the media too, and verbalized that. But without a doubt, his fault. He should not have been putting his car on the inside with Franco trying, coming out of the pits on cold tires, being ahead of him. Definitely should have yielded in that situation, and just kind of let Franco, go on and wait for that overtaking opportunity. Different part of the track where it's just a little less risky. So definitely deserved that penalty for Esteban. And of course, he lost time from the incident, but then had to come in to serve that penalty. And that basically took him out of contention and just really ruined his race. And there was really not a lot he could do to come back after that, especially with all of this happening so close to the end of the race. If it happened earlier, maybe he would have had time to make up those places, but just not the best timing for him with this incident. And with Esteban, I think the writing's on the wall that this is probably how this season will go for Haas and go for him. Now, I don't expect incidents like this to happen, time penalties and in all of these issues, but as far as just the performance gap between his teammate and between himself, I think this is just how it's going to go. I mean, you look at Esteban, he's been in this sport forever. He's probably a little bit over the hill when it comes to his prime. Not all the way over the hill, but he's crested it, and he's probably on the downside. Where you've got Ollie, 20 years old, 21 years old. I can't remember exactly what it is, but so much potential in that kid, and just he's destined for bigger things than Haas, and I think everyone knows that. And I think that's going to be a tough thing for Esteban to deal with. Being the veteran driver, being in that mentorship role, and then now facing the reality that your teammate, your younger teammate, is probably a lot better than you, and you're going to play second fiddle all season long. How will Esteban handle that? Will he still be able to maximize the results? And I think for him to do that, forget about Ollie. Stop trying to, catch up with him and use him as a litmus test of, he's here, I'm all the way down here. Don't let that get to your confidence. Just push the car and try to get the most out of the car. Try to ace these new regulations and these modes and everything that goes into driving this car. Focus on yourself. The results will come. Because if he's focusing on Ollie, it's going to spiral out of control. and it's just going to get worse and worse. And it's something that ultimately could affect his future if it really gets bad enough. And is something where Haas might look at the situation and say, do we want to continue this way? Or should we maybe look a little younger? So, not the best start to the season for Esteban. Not a great weekend for him. Not a great Sunday for him. A lot for him to work on. But, like I've said with other drivers, Liam Lawson, just focus on yourself. Focus on getting a good race in. Focus on getting a clean weekend in. And just maximize the results for yourself and try to block everything else out. If there was one other team that had an argument for best of the rest this weekend, I think it's got to be Alpine. Finally a good result for Alpine. P6 for Pierre Gasly, P10 for Franco Colapinto. Really good battles between both drivers and both Haas drivers, which, similar to what we saw with Ferrari. Not as much, didn't last as long, but at least some action and something that would have saved us a little bit if we didn't have that Ferrari action. But it's just always good to see cars, whether it's teammates, whether it's, drivers on opposing teams, just going wheel to wheel and battling it out through the corners, and especially at a track like this. Again, these regulations have problems. I'm not denying that. But stuff like that, it's just exciting. There's no denying that. If you're denying it, you're probably just too wrapped up in all of the regulation changes. And, we just need to take a step back a little bit because it's something good to see. But for Franco, finally gets his first point as an Alpine driver after a year and 2 races, finally accomplishes that and finally appeases Flavio Briatore and has some result to hang his hat on. But what went into this result? How did he get in this position? How did he finally get into the points? Started with this race start. Really good start to the race. Made it all the way up to 6th place. And then it was kind of just managing the pace from there. Of course, he did have that incident with Esteban Ocon coming out of the pits halfway through the race. And it's just unfortunate from Franco's side of things because with that, or without that, probably cost him a position and probably cost him an extra championship point because he ends up finishing, I think it was half a second behind Carlos Sainz. So without that incident, there's no question Franco would have finished P9 and gotten a additional championship point to his name. So a little bit tough there. At the end of the day, it is one championship point. We've seen one championship point make a difference, especially with these midfield teams. So not trying to downplay that, but at least he got something, and at least the damage was minimized to some extent. But finally, Franco Colapinto gets the result he needs. And finally, I can say here, he's another driver that I've been very critical of over the last year because what we saw with Williams in 2024 and what we saw with Alpine in 2025 were 2 totally different experiences with Franco Colapinto. And we knew that it was in him somewhere. And it was just most likely confidence, which I don't blame him one bit. If I had Flavio Briatore as a boss, I'd lose all of my confidence right away. So no fault on him there, but he finally got the results and he finally got something out of this car. And it's good to see. And hopefully it's something that helps him build some momentum moving forward with this team. For his teammate though, solid day for Pierre Gasly. Started P5 or P7. Realistically, I mean, that was a P5 with the 2 McLarens, not starting the race, but he just kind of maintained position. But at the end of the day, he looked really quick around here all weekend. There was a graphic that was thrown up in, I think it was qualifying, where the track comparison between where the Red Bull has the advantage, and the Red Bull being Max Verstappen, and where Pierre Gasly has the advantage in the Alpine. That track map was mostly pink, which was shocking to see because I mean Alpine, what we saw last weekend, it looked like it was going to be a repeat of 2025. In another season where they're just at the bottom and there's no hope. So to see them finally have this result, to see them have that pace in the car, and to compete with a team like Red Bull, really impressive. And there's a chance, probably a very good chance, that this Alpine car might be track specific. Favors a track like China a little more, doesn't favor a track like Australia. So that'll be something to watch out for and something that'll change as the season goes on. And of course will change too as upgrades start to come in the picture. And not only their car changes, but other cars change as well. But they at least have something and they've got a foundation to build on and they finally have some results to be happy about. For Racing Bulls, another solid result for Liam Lawson, finishing P7 after starting 14th. It mostly came down to the start for him. Like I said, the start, it matters, but at the end of the day, the overall race pace can kind of negate any time or any positions lost or positions gained from the race start. But Liam put himself in P7 to start this race, and he deserved to stay in P7 when it was all said and done. Very, very clean race. No incidents with any other drivers, which is something that I've been pounding my fist on the table for him to finally clean up. So I'm glad we've gotten to this point where he's avoided any contact with other drivers and any controversy, but just the type of race that we needed to see from Liam. And he really seemed to get the most out of this car this weekend, and specifically on Sunday. And he even had the disadvantage of coming into the pits a lap before the safety car came out. Something that likely would have taken him out of contention. But he's starting to get a handle on this car, and he's really starting to just get on top of things and get some confidence and clean some things up. And I'm impressed with Liam. I really am. And hopefully this is something that continues for him, because, he's rubbed me the wrong way, being a little too cocky sometimes in just some of the comments that he's made after a lot of these incidents with other drivers, and just refusing to take the blame and pointing the finger and just complaining and all of this. But it seems like he's starting to turn a corner, and I do hope that continues for him, and he really starts to figure things out, and just this builds some momentum for him. But again, really impressed with his ability to get the most out of this car, and really impressed for him to do that after last weekend too, when his rookie teammate in his first Grand Prix outperformed him and put together a very surprising result that a lot of us were talking about coming out of that Grand Prix weekend. So for Liam to take that on the chin, regroup, come back with this performance this weekend, really says a lot. And again, I'm really looking forward to seeing how his season plays out and if it builds off this performance. For his teammate, though, tough weekend for him. Only finished P12. A lot of reliability issues that made it a choppy weekend for Arvid Lindblad. Really weird moment in practice where it looked like his fire extinguisher went off. I didn't see any flames or anything like that that showed that his car was actually on fire. Really weird too, because I went back and looked at his onboard and just watched it through that whole sequence, and the issue happens, the smoke comes out. I don't know if it was an electrical problem and he couldn't radio in, but the team's just radioing in, asking, radio check. He's not responding. Gets out on the car, seems like he pulls over on his own, doesn't, pull over because the team tells him to. Doesn't really give any explanation as to what was going on there. So not sure what that issue is. But again, with these Red Bull power units, both with Red Bull, both with Racing Bulls, they've got some issues to figure out. And Arvid has been one who's kind of taken a little bit of the brunt of that with those reliability issues. And unfortunately, I think he'll probably continue to take a little bit of the brunt with that, because if they're going to figure anything out, if they're going to experiment, if they're going to give any team an advantage, Red Bull's going to get the power unit advantage from Ford when they're trying to sort all of this out. And Racing Bulls are probably going to be on their back foot a little bit and at somewhat of a disadvantage. So something to watch out for Arvid, but more so for the race. Great start for him, all the way up to 8th after starting 15th. But he was one who was hurt by the safety car and hurt by strategy, because he started that race on hard tires. So when that safety car came out on lap 10, just way too early for him to come in and go on to mediums. He would have had to make a second stop. And really, that safety car just cost him any advantage that he had or potentially had starting on those hard tires. So after that happened, just tough to recover from that, and you're kind of just in damage control mode. But then, of course, after that, he had a spin on lap 27. That put him further down the order. So a lot of things kind of going into this, some out of his control, some in his control, but just a tough result for him this weekend, especially coming after last weekend. But at the end of the day, it's what you should expect for a rookie. And from the car side of things, it's probably what you should expect at this point in the first season of new regulations. Going to Williams, Carlos Sainz finally gets this team some points. Finishes P9 after starting 17th. Made it all the way up to 11th at the start of the race. And of course, 3 of those positions were gained over cars that didn't start, but still a really good race start for Carlos Sainz. But a lot of this did come down to so many cars retiring and Sainz just kind of finding himself in a points position at the end of it. But at the end of the race, I talked about it when I was going over Alpine. He did a really good job holding off Franco at the end. I was watching the timing screens, of course, interested in where Alpine was ultimately going to finish. And of course, Sainz, with all of the problems that Williams has had, I thought it was without a doubt. There's no way that he's going to be able to hold Franco out with how Franco was closing in those final laps. But somehow, some way, he made it happen. So really good result for him and something that gives him, of course, an extra championship point. For his teammate, though, didn't even start the race due to a hydraulic issue. Unfortunate for him, and this team has a lot to figure out when it comes to reliability and when it comes to this car's performance, because reliability problems both race weekends have happened for both drivers. It's really hurting them, especially like I was saying for McLaren, because they're in the same boat. They have this new Mercedes power unit and they need time on track to figure it out and to get the data to just help guide them through this transition and help them try to maximize everything they can out of these new power units. And they're just not getting that right now with all of these reliability issues. Now, another big thing for them, the car's still overweight and significantly overweight. Not a lot is going to change until that car gets within the weight that they need it to be. And it also makes it hard to tell, do they have the speed? Do they have the performance in this car once that weight issue is figured out? And also, too, how much are they going to need to change to get the weight down? That might have a negative effect on performance when it's all said and done. So just a lot of unknowns with this Williams team. And just, again, a very disappointing position for them to find themselves in, considering the hope that they had at the end of last year, the hope that they had coming into these new regulations. It's just not there for them. And they've got a long process to get back where they were last year, not to mention where they hope to ultimately be. Going to Audi. Not the weekend I was thinking it would be for Audi. Nico DNF in the sprint. Gabriel Bortoleto, another driver who did not start the Grand Prix because of reliability issues. But it was also expected that they might look really strong at this track. And that just wasn't the case for those cars that did make it on track. Gabriel for the sprint race, Nico for the Grand Prix on Sunday. Not sure what the problem was with Gabriel's car, for Sunday. Something was discovered, obviously, in that pre-race, build up. They tried to fix it, brought it into the pits, hoping for a pit lane start, and it just didn't work out for them. And just too much for them to figure out and too much for them to fix on that short of notice. So, unfortunate for them. Unfortunate for Nico too, having that incident not finishing the sprint race too because of reliability issues. But again, kind of similar to Red Bull. It's probably something that needs to be a little expected with them, with these reliability issues, because this is another team. Of course, they were Sauber last year. It's not a completely new team, but Audi is designing their power units for the first time. There's a lot to figure out and a lot of risk that comes with that. And these reliability issues are just kind of part of that. When that happens, when you don't have an engine supplier with a history, with a background, and with the knowledge and experience of going through a regulation change like this and building a power unit from scratch. So something that's unfortunate for Audi, but also something that I wouldn't be surprised if it continues to happen throughout the season. For the other teammate, though, Nico Hülkenberg, mixture of misfortune for him today in the Grand Prix. Bad start to the race, dropped all the way down to 15th after starting 11th. Looked at his onboard, just didn't get it right. And that's something that it's just so hit or miss with these drivers. Again, you would expect it to happen to, maybe the less experienced drivers, but it's happened to everyone. It's happened to Max, it's happened to Kimi, it's happened to Nico, it's happened to, just so many drivers have dealt with this issue, and it's just something that's going to take time for them to perfect. But it wasn't just that for Nico. He was also hurt by the safety car because he was another driver that started on those hard tires. And again, when that safety car came out, it just didn't make sense for anyone on hard tires to come in and switch to mediums, knowing that it was probably going to lead to another pit stop, and those mediums were going to last for the rest of the race. So kind of just stuck in no man's land in not much you can do to salvage that situation. So Nico almost made it back into the points, making it all the way up to P11, but just not exactly there. And ultimately not the weekend that Audi was hoping it to be. All right, finishing up with the bottom two teams. Number 10, I've got Cadillac. Wasn't pretty, but both cars finished the race. P13 for Valtteri Bottas, P15 for Sergio Perez. Not a lot to say about Cadillac. Not a lot of action on track. Not a lot of, headlines or moments or anything like that. But they're taking steps in the right direction. They only finished one lap down. And again, both cars finished this race, which is an improvement from last weekend, where it was just Sergio Perez who finished that race, and he also finished 3 laps down. So for both cars to finish only 1 lap down, we're getting somewhere with Cadillac, but it's going to be a long season for Cadillac. We know that. I've talked about it. I'll continue to talk about it as the season goes on. There's just not a lot of hope that they're going to get anything out of this season. I don't expect them to get any points this year. I don't expect any surprise storybook moments like we had with Sauber last year, with Nico Hülkenberg getting his first podium. But Cadillac needs to just keep building momentum and having weekends like this. And they got the job done this weekend. They just need to continue to build and continue to carry this momentum from race weekend to the next. And you're going to have hiccups along the way. They finished the race. Both cars finished the race this weekend. There's a good chance we show up in Japan and one of them has reliability issues and does not finish. And, that's something that should be expected and something that shouldn't kick this team and put this team down, because it's a process. Coming into this sport, being a team like this, starting from scratch, it's extremely difficult to get up to speed, and it takes a very long time. It's not just a season. It takes multiple seasons to get there. So Cadillac just needs to keep building and just needs to keep hoping for performances like this and just slowly chipping away. But it is good to see them getting closer. Of course, they still have a long way to go, but we saw improvement from what we saw last weekend. And it's just good to see a team like this inching closer to looking like a real F1 team. But the last team, still struggling to look like a real F1 team. Aston Martin, just a terrible weekend for them. But unfortunately, it was as expected. The good news is they both finished the sprint race. The bad news is they both retired from the Grand Prix. Lance Stroll only made it nine laps. Fernando Alonso actually held on and made it 32 laps in the race. Scary stuff with him. And I don't know, I'd have to look back. I assume Lance Stroll, it was probably a reliability issue if he was retiring 9 laps in. But for Alonso, not reliability. That issue that we were warned about heading into the season, where the vibrations from this engine are so bad that it's causing these drivers to basically lose their feeling in their fingers and in their hands. That's terrible. I haven't been watching this sport forever. I'm not going to sit here and try to fake that, but I can't ever remember anything happening like this or hearing about this happening in the past, where a car vibrates so much that drivers' hands are literally going numb and they can't even hold onto the steering wheel. And that's what we saw. The onboards from Fernando Alonso, both at the race start, as he's sitting there trying to rev up his engine for the race start, the vibrations that car has, it's insane. And then also, too, as the race is going on, Fernando going 300, however fast he was, 300 kilometers down the straight, literally taking his hands off of the steering wheel because that's his only chance to get some relief from all of these vibrations. I don't know how he made it 32 laps watching, his onboards and knowing what the reason was for his retirement after the fact. For him to hold on that long, incredibly impressive. And I don't blame him one bit for coming in, because again, if it's this bad, and it was talked about, by Adrian Newey about this causing permanent nerve damage with the drivers, kind of, scoffed at that a little bit. It was like, okay, I know it's probably bad and they're not going to be able to finish the race, but permanent nerve damage seems a little more believable after watching this race and after watching what Fernando went through. But just a huge problem for Aston Martin, and one of many problems for them to figure out. And a lot of this comes down to Adrian Newey and a lot is on his plate right now. Again, just a really surprising position for this team to be in, considering he's leading the charge when it comes to the design of this car. But I wish this team would just pull the plug on him being the team principal and just let him focus on improving this car and building this car and trying to figure all this stuff out, because he wasn't even there this weekend. And apparently that's going to be a common theme where, they have planned out weekends that he's not going to be present as the team principal. It happens. We've seen Toto Wolff not be there as team principal. We've seen other team principals not be there for various reasons. With how bad it is for Aston Martin right now, you got to have your team principal there. And if Adrian Newey needs to focus on the car, let's get someone else who can serve as team principal. Why are we dividing these duties? And when the car is this bad, why are we taking one of the most brilliant minds who, were in this situation? Of course, there's a lot of blame on Honda right now from the Aston Martin side. So that's internal stuff that we're never really going to get to the bottom of. But if anyone can figure it out, it's him. Why are we dividing his duties? Why are we making him be team principal? Lock him in a room in that Aston Martin facility and let him just work and work and work. And that's something that he enjoys how to do. I've read his book in the offseason. Great book if anyone, hasn't read it. But he loves that stuff. He loves figuring out these problems. He loves isolating himself and just trying to get to the bottom of these types of issues. And that's what Aston Martin needs to do right now. So I wish they would just nip things in the bud, get him out as team principal, let him focus on the car, let him be in the role that suits him the best. But just really, really weird situation with Aston Martin on a lot of fronts right now, but a lot of problems for this team to address. And I don't know when it's going to get better for Aston Martin, but as of now, doesn't look like there's much hope for them in the future. All right, that'll do it for today's episode, recapping the Chinese Grand Prix weekend. I didn't talk about it in this episode, but of course we got the confirmation over the weekend that the Bahrain and Saudi Arabian Grand Prix will be canceled and will not be replaced on the calendar, reducing the number of races from 24 to 22, and also meaning we're not going to have any race action in the month of April. I think it might be a blessing in disguise. A little disappointed that we won't have these races replaced by Portimao or Istanbul or even Imola. But with all of these problems with these new regulations, it might be a good thing to have a month off and to give F1 and the FIA just a little bit of time to maybe do some minor changes and put those in place with these regulations to improve a few things. But for the near future, at least, our next race weekend is in 2 weeks for the Japanese Grand Prix. So we'll be off next weekend, but then after that, back at it. So I'll be back with a preview episode heading into that race weekend, followed by another recap episode. But of course, keep an eye on the social media channels for the Chicanery podcast, because there's a chance you never know what happens in this sport and what comes up when we're on an off week. So just keep an eye on those for any news and any short videos that I might post. But for now, thank you to everyone for tuning in and listening. Till next time.